Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to share some stitching themed cards inspired by the new Nichole's Needlework collection from Spellbinders. They sent them over to create with and share with you, and I love how fun this stitching inspired collection is. There's some generic ones in the original set or the main set, and then there are some holiday themed ones. So we have fall or Halloween themed, and then a couple Christmas themed ones, and I love the variety. The main set has the embroidery hoop as well as the accessories, so the ones that go with them can be used with that, or you could just create cards with those pieces alone without that embroidery hoop. There's also a sentiment stamp set to go with it, and they also have some wood shaped embroidery hoops. These are not real embroidery hoops, they're just the look of it. So I'm going to use that one on my last creation. For my first one, I'm using the main Gathering Stitches die set as well as the Needleworker toolkit. Now I'm using some Spellbinders watercolor paper for my background, but I wanted to create this rainbow and kind of have a light bluey gray in the background. I didn't have any cardstock that was the correct color that I wanted, so I'm just using a little bit of Distress Reinker in Speckled Egg to lightly wash over that piece, and then I'm going to let that dry. I'm going to make sure that there's a little bit it's a little bit darker around the edges. I just wanted it to be not the natural watercolor color because of the rainbow. I kind of thought it looked better if it was on a bluish background for sky, so I thought I'd create it. So I just have a wide water brush here. I'm just making sure there's a nice even coat over the whole thing, and then adding a little bit extra around the edges. You have to do this with either watercolor paper or mixed media heavy stock. It needs to be some sort of cardstock that can handle that moisture. If you have regular cardstock, you could do a little light ink blending to create a similar look. For the florals, I used the florals from the fall set, the pumpkin set, as well as the main set, and I thought it would be fun to give them kind of the look of clouds below that rainbow. So I'm just using some Lost Shadow Distress ink to lightly ink blend the edges. These were die cut out of white cardstock, so I wanted to give it a little bit of shadow around the edges, but I didn't want to add any color, so Lost Shadow was perfect for that. For creating the embroidery bases, there is an outside ring that gets cut at the same as the inside part. So I just took a circle die set that I had that was a little bit bigger than that inside ring, but a little bit smaller than the outside ring, to glue those two pieces to create my design on before adding it to the front of a card. You could easily just add this directly to the front of a card and you wouldn't have to worry about that circle behind it. But I wanted to have my piece completely done and be able to place it on the front of the card and decide whether I wanted it sitting nice and straight or if I wanted it a little bit tilted. I wanted to have that freedom, and I wouldn't have been able to do that if I had glued this directly to the card. I would have been committed to the positioning of this. For the little embroidery hoop top, I die cut it out of a glossy silver cardstock. This is from the Treasured Cardstock collection packages from Spellbinders. They come in silver, rose gold, and gold, and each one of those packages have 5 different cardstock finishes to them. So it's a great way to add metallics to your holiday cards, and I love the fact that there's 5 different choices in each one. So you have a nice selection to pick which ones are going to work best for what you're creating. For my rainbow cardstock, I chose lighter pastel colors when possible. There was a couple that I didn't have light colors available. So I'm using all Spellbinders cardstock. They are Dahlia, Pink Sand, Persimmon, Waterfall, Teal Topaz, Raindrop, Purple Mist, and white cardstock for those flowers. I wanted this to be kind of a little bit more of a babyish theme card, but I love the fact with this rainbow that you can choose bright colors, earth tones, pastels. You have a lot of freedom. And when you die cut the rainbow, it die cuts every single layer of the rainbow. So you can die cut a bunch of different colors and then use one of each layer for the card, but you'll have a ton of different layers left. So you can just swap up your layers and create a bunch of cards very quickly all at once because you're cutting those pieces all together. while my rainbow is completely drying, I'm just going to lay the flowers along the bottom just to see if I like them as a cloud or if I need to change up my design a little bit. And I liked how they were going to look. I thought it was fun to use those flowers for that. I didn't use the leaves to the flowers, but you certainly could. I considered die cutting them in a gray cardstock and using them with it. I ended up opting not to, but I think you absolutely could do that as well. There are 2 upper layers to go on some of the thicker layers of the rainbow, and I just die cut those out of a darker cardstock than what was below so that they would be nice and visible. Now, if you've seen my previous videos, you know that I love to glue with liquid glue. I like it in a nice fine tip bottle. I can glue all of these pieces together with that. For the rainbow pieces, it was very handy to have a pair of reverse tweezers to hold those pieces while I put the glue on, as well as while I placed it on my piece here. Some of those rainbow pieces are really, really thin, and by having a nice fine tip bottle for that, I could really control how much glue I was using on it, and it was also much easier to place it while that piece of cardstock or that die cut was in my tweezers and my hands were out of the way. So you'll also find that you don't get nearly as much glue on your hands when you're using a pair of reverse tweezers to hold those pieces. Now, I did all my die cutting for all of these cards all at one time, and I organized them in the medium craft stacks from Spellbinders. These have come to be such an invaluable tool for me when I'm creating. I love the fact that I can die cut a bunch, organize them in these craft stacks, and have them ready to go. They're easy to grab each piece or each collection of die cuts that I have, bring them to where I'm creating, and it keeps them nice and contained as well. And I can also move my crafting stuff to different areas if I need to very easily without having to worry about dropping any pieces of what I'm creating. And the ones that I like are the medium ones, so they're just a little bit bigger than an A2 size card, so you could easily do your die cutting, have your card base in there, and it would be perfect for taking to crops or taking to a friend's house to create with, and just having all of your pieces ready together. I did a little bit of ink blending around the outside part of that embroidery hoop frame. I just used some hickory smoked distress pad, and then I also use that same distress ink to do a tiny little bit of ink blending around the thread spool just to give a little bit of shadow to it. I created a thin mat with pink sand cardstock, and that was cut at 5 3/8 by 4 1/8. And then I have a piece of light gray that is cut to 4 inches by 5 1/4. It just gives a really nice background for this embroidery hoop piece. While those are drying, I like to put an acrylic block on top just to hold everything nice and flat. And then I can also take my pieces and lay them on top of the acrylic block just to see if I'm liking the layout that I have envisioned in my head. Now, that embroidery hoop is cute enough on its own, but with the little thread as well as the needle and scissors, I think it takes it to the next level. The scissors look like little antique sewing scissors, and I absolutely love their adorable design. They come in 2 pieces, or you die cut them in 2 pieces. This is the package of treasured cardstock from Spellbinders that I'm using. And I die cut them out of that mirror silver because I like the nice shine that it gives it. For the sentiment, I chose a sentiment that I had foiled in a previous foiling session, and it is the Curvy Everyday Foil Sentiments. I used some Prism Glimmer foil on it, and it's foiled right on that pink sand cardstock, which is the same color that I used for part of the rainbow as well as that mat. After I have that sentiment on there, as well as the little accessories, we're done. This is the set that it's from. There is a welcome baby sentiment or plate in there. I hadn't had that already foiled, and we were in the middle of a heat wave, so I really didn't want to be taking out my foiling machine. So I just chose a different sentiment that was nice and generic that would work for a baby card. So for my next card, I chose to use the Faux embroidered pumpkin die set to go with that Gathering Stitches die set, as well as the Needlework toolkit. I used the Gathering Stitches for every single project in this video, and most of them I used the Needlework toolkit because I just couldn't get enough of those scissors and the little thread spool. The background again is die cut out of Spellbinders watercolor cardstock, and I'm doing a little light ink blending with gathered twigs distress ink. Doing a little bit on the outside of the main embroidery piece, as well as my pumpkin, the little thread spool, and the little piece of thread that goes on top of that. I figured I would just use the same color for all of it, but you could easily choose different colors for it. it was all going to work with the same color scheme anyways. Once again, I have Spellbinders watercolor paper that I used for the centerpiece. I like the off-white color to this, especially for this particular project. I did die cut a second piece for the ring to go on top of it because I wanted it to look like a wood ringed embroidery hoop on there. So I chose a nice dark color that was going to work well with the fall colored theme. And the die set that I'm using has a witch's hat as well if you wanted to make it a little bit more on the Halloween side. I chose to keep it a little bit more generic with a fall theme to it. So I did the pumpkin as well as some of the florals from that set in fall colors. And then there's also a leaf die in that set that cuts a bunch of different leaves that I also cut in different fall florals. I'm using persimmon cardstock for that pumpkin. This dark green here is fern cardstock. And then I also die cut some peridot cardstock, which is the lighter, more limey green, as well as poppy field, which is the red, and beeswax, which is the yellow. So I like to assemble all of my die cut pieces together when possible before adding them to the front of the embroidery hoop, depending on which pieces they are. Some of the die cuts I will half assemble and then do the rest of it on the piece, and you'll see that towards the end. But something like this pumpkin, it makes more sense to have the little vines as well as the leaves and the stem already on there to place onto that background. I also glued down the top of the embroidery hoop. For this card, because we have a fall theme going, I chose to use the rose gold treasured cardstock pack. And for my background, I'm using the Leafy Helix embossing folder. And then because I'm going to use a really dark color for my card base, I chose to use the beeswax cardstock to create a piece for the inside of my card, and I'm going to stamp my sentiment on there. The Sentiment Stamps collection has a lovely blend of Christmas and fall sentiments with a beautiful mix of different scripts and fonts. So there's one that says, "Let the magic of Christmas bring love and peace to you in the world." And the other says, "Good tidings to you and Merry Christmas for today and all Christmases to come. This Christmas, may your heart be light and your stocking heavy. Wishing you a little extra Christmas magic this year." And then a couple fall ones with Harvest of Thanks and So Much to be Grateful for. So I love the fact that they coordinate well with the fall and Christmas sentiment or themed dies in this collection, but they're also some really lovely and different sentiments. So I used my Misti stamping tool in order to help with that sentiment. So that way I could stamp it multiple times just to make sure to get a nice, clear and dark image for the center of that card. And then I put the insert on the inside of the card, once again with that same Barely Art glue. And with everything ready to go, I can start to assemble my card. So once again, using that Barely Art glue, especially for embossed backgrounds, you want to make sure to be liberal with the glue on the background and make sure a lot of the areas that are recessed and going to touch the card base, that has some glue on it so it gets some good adhesion to it. Put my acrylic block on top of it to hold that in place down nice and flat. And then I just laid down my embroidery hoop. Here I'm trying to decide whether I want it to sit up nice and straight or whether I want it a little tilted. I tend to lean towards the tilted. I think it looks a little bit more interesting, but you can do either one of them. Neither one is right or wrong. And then trying to decide where I want to have the florals on my pumpkin. Now I chose to stick with the leaves and the florals that were in this die collection, but Spellbinders also has a autumn leaf die set that I think would be fantastic mixed with this as well. I think it would be really fun to mix up some different color or different shaped fall leaves. And you could also take these pumpkins and cut multiple and then just cut some of these sections off the side just to give them a little bit of variation, a little bit of a different shape if you wanted to change it up just a little bit. Once I had my pumpkin glued to the center, I decided to glue down my thread die cut as well, or my thread spool die cut, as well as the needle and thread. I only put glue on the needle part and a tiny little bit of the thread because I wanted to make sure that I had the freedom to move that thread out of the way to have it positioned the way I want to. I also cut the tip off the needle to make it look like it was sticking in the spool thread, just a different way to give it a little bit of a different look as well. With all of those main elements down, now I can start gluing down my florals as well as my leaves. I ended up just using my fingers to hold these pieces, but I do find that it's much easier to use a pair of reverse tweezers to have them out of the way, and then you can be a little bit more careful with placing them as well. The nice thing about using a liquid glue is because it's liquid, it doesn't dry completely right away. So you have some freedom to tuck those leaves behind there, to tuck a floral behind there, and you're not totally 100% stuck on the layout until you've let it sit and dry for a few minutes. So I love having that freedom and that flexibility there. So I put a little bit of the florals at the bottom of the pumpkin, a little bit at the top, and then I thought it would look nice also on the top of the embroidery hoop as well. And I like to put the main florals down first, and then I'll start tucking in the leaves in behind it. By putting those florals down first, I'll have a little bit of an idea of where I might want leaves to fill in the area. And I'm also choosing leaves that are different colors from the florals that I have placed in, like, right by it. So when I'm doing my die cutting for things like this, I like to just die cut a whole bunch, more than I think I'm going to need. And that way, when I'm doing the gluing, I have lots of selection to choose from, as well as the fact that I know that I'm not going to run out and have to stop and do some die cutting in the middle of it. Any of the pieces that I have left, I'll put in a tiny little Ziploc bag, store it with the same die set that I used. So next time I go to use that die set, I'll have some already die cut. And if I'm ever looking for die cuts from that set, I'll know exactly where to look. It'll be very easy to find them because they'll be right with that die set. It's also a great way to use up a ton of cardstock scraps because a lot of the dies for creating these pieces are fairly small, so you don't need large pieces of cardstock, so it's a great way to use up those pieces. Another fun thing to do to add a little bit more texture, as well as regular cardstock, would be to use that treasured gold or treasured rose gold cardstock pack that I used to die cut the scissors, the needle, and the top of the embroidery hoop, and just cut a few different leaves or florals from some of the different textures and tuck those in with it. It's going to tie that rose gold in beautifully, and like I said, just give it another element of texture. What I'm going to do for this instead is I have some rose gold stickles. So I'm going to put just a dot of rose gold stickles in the center of each of those flowers. It's going to tie that rose gold in and give those flowers a center to them. You could also take some rhinestones or pearls and use those for the centers of the flowers as well. Even adding some shimmer spray onto some of the cardstocks before die cutting them would also be a great way to add a little bit of a different texture as well as a bit of different shine. So now that I've got all my pieces in place, I can add the rose gold stickles. Again, I'm just doing a dot in the center of the flower, so they're really not going to take that long to dry. I also took my fine tip bottle from my glue and squeezed just a little bit of it below the thread die cut to secure that in place. And then I thought I wanted to use a little bit of those extra die cuts to enhance the inside of the card as well. So I did wait for the stickles to dry just a little bit, so they're not totally wet, they're not totally cured either, but my card isn't lying totally flat on my surface while I'm doing this. So I'm just doing the same type of formation or same type of arrangement on the inside of my card that I did on the pumpkins, just putting those florals in place first, then I'm going to tuck in the little leaves. Great way to use up a little bit of extra of your die cuts, as well as enhancing the inside of your card. You could also, instead of putting the thread spool and the needle inside or on the front of the card, you could also add it to the inside of the card as well, and that would look fantastic. And of course, I also had to finish those off with a dot of the rose gold stickles in the centers of those flowers as well. I love this fun little fall themed stitching inspired card, perfect for someone that loves to do needlework or stitching. So for my third card here, I'm using the Stockings die set, and I'm going to do this in a non-traditional color scheme. So I am using some Salvage Patina Distress ink just to add a little bit of color on the outside of my inside of my embroidery hoop. So if you can't tell, the die for the inside of the embroidery hoop gives you little piercing marks. It doesn't go all the way through, so those aren't holes, but it gives you the look of Aida cloth. And I love the fact that it has that detail to it. It gives it a little bit more authenticity and is a really nice touch with this die set. Once again, I'm using the circle die cut on the back of it just to glue all of those pieces together so that I can have everything together to put onto the front of my card. For the background of my card, I'm using an evergreen embossing folder, and I'm using it with the same watercolor cardstock from Spellbinders. I love the cream tone to this, especially for these particular cards. I just love the warmth it gives them. I am taping that piece of cardstock inside my embossing folder because I'm going to ink my background, and I want to make sure that I can do this multiple times and I don't have to match up that pattern. So by taping it in place, I can know that it's going to stay exactly where I put it, and I can open it up, re-ink that embossing folder, because I find that when I ink my embossing folders, especially when they're brand new, I'll have to do it a couple times to get some nice clear coverage on that background. So I do this 3 times just to build up that ink. That ink is going to get darker. So if you want to make sure that it's not too dark, then I would choose with a really light colored ink in the first place. This one is Evergreen Bow. I just figured it was a perfect ink color name to go with this embossing folder. It just suited it well, and it also suited the color scheme. So that really makes the branches of the background pop. What you could do if you wanted a little bit of a different look is you could just emboss it on its own, and then you could do some really light ink blending just to color those pine or those evergreen sprigs if you wanted just that colored. You do have to be very careful with it because it's very easy to get some of that ink onto your background, but another way to get a little bit of a different look. So I taped a piece of silver cord onto that background before gluing it onto my card base. I also used my guillotine trimmer, and I trimmed this down to 4 inches by 5 1/4. I like to do it on all 4 sides when I've got an embossed piece, because sometimes it gets a little bit warped or a little bit wonky, and I wanted to make sure that all of those sides were nice and straight. So once that background piece was glued down and set on my card base, I took that silver cord, pulled it down, and taped it in place on the front. This is going to be covered with that embroidery hoop, and I thought it would be fun to make this look as if it was an embroidery hoop Christmas ornament. So that is what that silver cord is for. And then I'm also going to finish the piece off by putting a bow on the top of that embroidery hoop as well. So it'll tie it all in together. That silver cord is not very thick, so it's quite subtle. If you want it to be a little bit more obvious, you could use a silver ribbon instead, but I just wanted a subtle look there, just a little bit of the silver to tie everything in with all of the silver accents that I have. While waiting for the pieces on my card front to dry, I can assemble my die cuts. So I have everything die cut once again, and I'm using a non-traditional color scheme that I've been absolutely loving lately. So the Spellbinders cardstocks that I'm using here are Dahlia, Pink Sand, Waterfall, and Teal Topaz. So it's some corals as well as some teals. And I typically go with traditional colors most of the time for Christmas, but this one I absolutely love, and I'm not totally sure why, but I am going for it. For my white accents there, I actually have white glitter cardstock that has been die cut to give it a little bit of extra sparkle. And I am using my reverse tweezers to place a lot of these die cuts because some of them are really quite tiny. So those tweezers really help. Holding them in there to put the glue on, and then placing them down, and just using the fingers from my other hand to press those pieces down. Once again, these pieces are nice and tiny, so they're perfect for using up a bunch of cardstock scraps. And that's one of the things I love about this set. I love I know tiny pieces aren't everyone's cup of tea. I love them on occasion for using up a bunch of cardstock scraps, and the final result, even though sometimes they're a little bit fiddly, the final result, in my opinion, is almost always worth it. I always love the final look of it. They create such sweet, adorable little images. So for things like this is where reverse tweezers as well as liquid glue in a fine tip bottle really comes in handy. I like to do all my die cutting in one shot, because I find that's the part about these things that are the least fun. And by having them all together ready in those craft stacks divided between the different cards that I'm making, it's just a matter of gluing the little pieces together. Sometimes I'll put on a movie while I'm doing this. Other times I'll just sit and kind of daydream while I am assembling the die cuts to the pieces below. These ones are really easy to assemble because there's little indentations where those pieces go. So there's no guesswork to trying to figure out how to put any of this together. After I have the pieces for my stockings put down, I have some strings die cut in silver for those stockings. So I'm just adding a little bit of glue, and they have a little round piece on the end, so it's perfect for adding that glue to and then putting that stocking on top. Once again, just like all of my other die cutting, once I put the pieces together, I just put my acrylic block on top of there, holds everything in place and keeps everything nice and flat, frees up my hands to work on the next step. So once everything was glued together and that glue had set, I could start assembling the front of my card. So I'm just putting that candy cane down and then hanging off my stockings from there. And because all of these are assembled already, it makes the card making or the assembly process go so quick. So it's really worth it to, especially when you're using pieces like this, to assemble them ahead of time, have them all ready to go, and then just put everything onto the front of the card all at once. This, I think, would also be adorable, these stockings, if you happen to have like a fireplace die cut or something like that. Or you could even use them just hanging off a pine branch on the front of a card. You wouldn't even need to use the stocking if you wanted to just use the pine branch from this. I love these on the back of that embroidery hoop backing, but I think they would also be adorable just on the front of a card for something clean and simple. I think they would really have a lot of versatility to them. So there's some tiny holly that I'm going to add to these pieces as well. I die cut them out of both the waterfall as well as the teal topaz, because when I was die cutting, I wasn't sure what the background color was going to be. I hadn't paid attention to which stocking I created in what color. And it worked out perfect because one of them I used the darker color and one of them I used the lighter color. So that finished it off quite nicely. And again, these holly die cuts were really tiny, so a great way to use up little pieces of cardstock scraps because these fit into so many tiny areas. So here's the little bow that I'm creating to go on the top of the embroidery hoop. I create the bow while it's still on the spool and make it the size that I want, and then I cut both ends off evenly. So I'll put both ends together, hold them together, and then die cut them all at once. With that bow on there, I can let that sit and dry. The cord does not like to have that, or does not like the liquid glue, so it will really move if you don't let it sit there all on its own. For some of the detail on the stockings, I'm just using a shimmer pen and just adding a little bit on some of the plainer stockings. It's going to add just a touch of shimmer. That's absolutely perfect. Then for that candy cane, I thought it would be fun if the inside sections had a little bit of sparkle to them. So I just inserted a little bit of stickles, and then I'll set that aside to dry. And while I was doing this, it reminded me that I had intended to add some white gel pen details to the rainbow card, but we're in the middle of a heat wave. My brain is absolutely mush, so I'll have an idea and then it will be out of my brain within minutes because it's just not holding anything. So I went back to that card, grabbed my white Signo gel pen. This was my favorite white gel pen, and I'm just adding some white stitching details. It's going to tie in the white from the clouds as well as just give a little bit of a different look to that rainbow. This is not a detail that you absolutely need to do. You could even, if you want to do it in that same shimmer pen that I just used for the stockings, if you wanted something a little bit more subtle, but just had some shimmer that would catch the light when you tilted the card. But it's a fun detail and something that I enjoy adding once in a while. This is not something I do often, but every once in a while, it's just fun to add white gel pen detail to it. So now we have this card done, and I wanted to add a sentiment to the inside. Typically, I will put the sentiments on the inside before I add everything to the front of the card. I just didn't think of it. So I'm choosing one of the sentiments from the coordinating stamp set that goes with this. This one is a Christmas themed one, and I'm stamping it with Evergreen Bow Distress ink. I had a little thread on my stamp there, so you definitely want to take that off with tweezers before stamping your image, because if you have a little thread on there, it's definitely going to affect your stamped image. So after stamping it multiple times using my Misti stamping tool, it is ready to go, and I can set that card aside and let that ink dry. So I love the way that final card looked. The only thing is I wish I had started with a lighter color for that background so that that would be a tiny little bit more subtle, but I still love that color scheme. For my last project, because it's not a card, I'm going to use one of those wooden embroidery hoop frames, and I'm going to paint it with some tarnished brass distress paint. I was kind of inspired by the last card by the look of the embroidery hoop being an ornament, and I thought it would be fun to create that with one of those wooden embroidery hoops. So I just used a small brush, and I did 2 coats on the front of the frame, 1 coat on the back of the frame. There's not going to be a whole lot of the back of that frame that is visible anyways. And then I also put some paint on the inside as well as the outside. I want to make sure that that front, the inside and the outside looks really good and is completely covered. And that's why the 2 coats. 1 coat might have been okay, but there was a couple areas that I found it was a little bit on the thin side. So that second coat really helped. This paint does give fairly good coverage though, which is why 1 coat probably would have been okay. But I like to err on the side of caution and make sure that it's completely done. Now, I should have done the front and the sides, then done the back, and then done the front and the sides again, waiting between each time for them to dry. I was impatient. So because most of this back is not going to be showing, I did the entire thing and then set it down to dry. And the back didn't totally dry. There were some areas that were a little bit wet when I did the second coat, but they dried enough while I was doing that second coat. While I was waiting for that to completely dry, I can start assembling my tree. And for this piece, I'm using the Faux embroidered spruce. I also have some gold accents with this one using the treasured gold cardstock packs from Spellbinders. I just used the mirrored gold, but if you wanted something a little bit more subtle, you could also use one of the different finishes, or even the glitter cardstock would be fun for this. I only use them for the star as well as the ornaments, just to add just a little bit of a metallic touch to it. I also have some red die cuts that are the ornaments. The ornaments themselves have 2 pieces. There's a small circle with a line sticking out of it, and then there are some larger circles. The larger circles get glued to the small ones. The line part is the little hanging part for the ornament. Once again, much easier to take these assemblies off of the tree, and then once they're dry, add them to the tree. Once you have these assembled together, they're so easy to add. And they're also really easy to assemble with by using a jewel picker to pick up those larger leaves and just place them, pick up the larger circles and just place them onto the smaller circles. Now my tree was just about the same size as the inside of that wooden hoop. So rather than fiddling with it, I decided to glue it down to my base first and then glue that wooden hoop on top of it. The base, once again, is that Spellbinders watercolor cardstock die cut. Again, I love the off-white tone to this for these particular pieces. Once the wooden hoop had dried on my background, I can start adding those ornaments. And these ones, it's almost essential to have the reverse tweezers to hold them in place while you're placing them. And I place them so that it looks like that hanger is hanging right off the branch. I try to disperse the red ones first, kind of doing it all over the tree, and then I inserted some of the gold ones. And again, made sure that they're all spread around, that I don't have certain colors all in one area or another color all in one area. I wanted to make sure that they're nice and evenly dispersed around that tree. So because this tree is already glued down, and because these ornaments are already assembled and glued together, very easy to add them to the tree. And even that wooden hoop, the dimension of it, it didn't inhibit anything at all. Now, if you didn't want to be bothered with tiny die cuts like this, another option would be to use some rhinestones or some pearls. And once I have these ornaments down and the glue has set, I am going to add a few pearls to this just for that little bit of different texture and dimension. I also like to add a little bit of glossy accents on top of these ornaments, but I'm going to wait until they are completely stuck to my piece first. And then I'll add that little bit of glossy accents and let that totally dry. It gives some fun shine and dimension to the cardstock ornaments, but it also adds a great element of dimension to the metallic die cut ones. And I really love the look of it. And for something like this, it works really well. So when adding it, I do make sure that that ornament is totally covered. And you'll also want to make sure that there's no bubbles in that glossy accents. If there happens to be bubbles, just take a pin and pop it with a pin while it is still wet. If you've let it dry, there's no way to get that bubble out. Once that has completely dried, look at the shine that it gives those ornaments, and I think it really enhances it and gives it some extra texture. Now is when I'm going to go in and just add some of those pearls. You don't really see them on the video, but they do show up in real life, and it just adds again a little bit of a different texture and a little bit of a different dimension. These pearls have different sizes in them, so you can do them all the same size, or you can pick and choose different sizes throughout the tree. I just did the same size just for simplicity, but I think it would be fun to do different sizes as well. You could also color those pearls with Copic markers or permanent markers if you wanted them in a different color tone. For the top of my embroidery hoop, I just did a loop of red metallic cord, looped it through the top for a hanger, and then this die set has some extra dies of spruce branches, and I die cut them in the same fern cardstock, and I'm gluing that to the top. I'll add a red bow out of that same cord just to finish the top off a little bit. Now, I forgot to mention, the tree itself is die cut out of fern cardstock, and those red ornaments are die cut out of poppy field cardstock. For a finishing touch on top of that bow, I just had some white floral die cuts from the faux pumpkin, faux embroidered pumpkin die set, just to finish off that top arrangement. You could also take these flowers and disperse them amongst the trees, and I laid them out off screen, and I thought it was a little bit too much, so I didn't do that, but it would be a fun way to use them as well. I just did these in white cardstock so they'd be nice and neutral, but you could also choose a color. Here you can see how they would look on the tree itself, and you could, like I said, you could use a color and then they would be a little bit more visible. For a finishing touch on those flowers, I'm just adding a pearl to the center of them. I'm choosing the tiniest or the smallest pearl from this pack. The easiest way to apply those pearls, or to apply the gems with the adhesive on the back, is to kind of use a die pick, poke it into that adhesive, and then press them on your project. So here are the finished projects from the Nichols Needlework collection. I absolutely love the variety in the collection and the uniqueness. It's something that's totally different, but it would be so fun to make these and give to someone that you know loves stitching or embroidering. Perfect touch for them. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you spending your time with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.